It was 2021 when I first got to lay my eyes on the announcement of Forspoken. And it looked amazing. Forspoken was a game I was enthralled with from the moment I got to see its announcement, and I tried to keep up with any news I could and wishlisted it on Steam when I had gotten the chance. I was even disappointed when the game was initially delayed, and when it was delayed to release into 2023. With these delays though, I still waited patiently for the game to release and looked forward to any sort of trailer or news we would get, and the trailers we eventually started to get showcased the gameplay. But within these trailers, there were issues people began to notice, specifically with the dialogue. There was a tonal dissonance of what the game was showing us with the dialogue spoken by the game's main character, Frey, which is what caught most people's attention, and was ultimately the beginning of a shitstorm. Even though I found it a bit rough, I still held on to hope because what we were being shown alongside this dialogue that everyone had been latching onto was still looking promising. Trailers continued to release, both gameplay and story related, and almost universally people agreed the dialogue presented to us was cringy and annoying. People had already given up on the game, and this was accentuated once a public demo had become available and people could finally play it and form their own opinions, except for me, because the demo was only available on the PlayStation. So I had to look at videos on Twitter and YouTube to see more gameplay. Although I saw a few people actually talking about how they had enjoyed it, with a few minor complaints to the gameplay, the majority of what I saw was nothing but hate for the game, from those who played it and those who watched. This discouraged me greatly. It made me scared for what the game was going to be. People complained about the cuff, people complained about the gameplay, people complained about the protagonist, the story, the difficulty, the graphics. People complained about Forspoken. I was hopeful, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried. Then, the game was released, and people began to talk more about it on social media since it was now fully playable. Immediately, videos started popping up on YouTube, talking about how bad the game was and not to buy it. People on Twitter posting dialogue clips, and the comments are just flooded with nothing but hate, and reviews for the game was just a sea of red from users. Despite this, I wanted to finally play the game I had been waiting so patiently for. The game I was hoping would be good, hoping for it to not become another disappointing game to add to my ever-growing catalog. During my time playing, I'd still kept up with how people were talking about the game, both review outlets, content creators, the masses, and even some of my friends. I'm not finished with the game just yet. In fact, I'm about 10 hours in and still playing, but I needed to make this video because of the things I'm seeing and hearing elsewhere. Forspoken is as average as it gets. Nothing more, nothing less. And I want to talk about it. Before going any further, I would also like to state that I am playing the PC version of the game, not the PS5 version. The reason I'm saying this will make a little bit more sense later on. Now, let's move on. I am an avid believer in the idea of everyone has their own tastes. A game you may like is something that I may not like, and Forspoken is no different. When I started playing Forspoken and actually got to experience the game for what it was, I immediately could tell that this will not be for everyone. But let's start off from the beginning. Forspoken is an action RPG that follows the character of Frey as she is whisked into another realm called Athia by a sentient magical cuff that grants her magical abilities. While there, she is in search of a way home and is doing everything in her power to get back, while also attempting to help the people of Athia by defeating the now mad protectors of the realm. In her life before being teleported to Athia, you learn that Frey is an orphan who frequently gets caught up with the law, and even in the wrong crowds, as she finds herself being the pawn of a gang to get what they want. Through the opening act though, we learn that she plans to get away from it all, as she's been saving up money to slip away from her current life of squatting in an abandoned apartment and away from the gang using her. Unfortunately, this doesn't go to plan as she loses what little she already has in a fire. During one of her late nights, in a moment of vulnerability, she finds a golden cuff laying in an abandoned room where she promptly checks it out and is teleported to Athia, where the game begins. It's a fairly generic story that grabs influences from Alice in Wonderland, which it references directly every so often. I have very little issue with the story. It's nothing groundbreaking, and it's ultimately fine. Frey as a protagonist is fine as well. She is far from being anything amazing, as she is a narcissistic, somewhat static asshole of a character that looks out only for herself, and this makes sense. All her life she has had nothing, could trust no one, and has recently had her dreams of turning her life around ripped away from her. She has only known me, me, me. You can even see how the writers try and play off of this with the scenes in the story, such as how she reacts to being called a hero, having people actually care about her, as well as her coming to terms with the fact she's now intertwined with the conflict she wants nothing to do with. She's cold, she's distant, and doesn't want to let anyone in. She only cares about herself and does what she can for the betterment of herself. My issue is how this contrasts heavily with her dialogue and constant snarky remarks, which many are pointing out. It's not because it's cringy. Although some may find cringy moments, it's because it is so different than the story they're trying to tell. I could absolutely see her becoming this character they wanted her to be over the course of hours of playtime, as she adjusts to this new life, this new world, and her new capabilities, almost forgetting about the troubles she had before. But being this way from the jump, especially since she just got into this new foreign world, it's quite jarring. Frey as a somewhat static character is fine, as we do see growth from her over time, but the story beats and surrounding dialogue should have accounted for that. As for that dialogue and story, there are genuinely decent moments, some of which actually got a smile for me or even made me feel something, but there are moments that felt quite out of place, mostly revolving around some of Frey's dialogue. The game is also fairly slow to get started. It didn't pull its leash off of me until around 2 to 3 hours in, which is about when I could finally enjoy the open world. Even some of the early playable sections before the game opened up to me felt ultimately pointless. The stealth section at the beginning of the game was drawn out, boring, and had no reason to exist. This moment in the jail cell where I could move around was also pointless, as there was nothing for me to actually do, and it started a cutscene anyway. The burning down of Frey's living space, although important to the story, didn't need to be interactive and could have been a cutscene. Tedium is the best way to describe these moments because they could have ultimately just been a cutscene to move along the story. I feel as though these moments of interactivity or gameplay were added due to the sheer amount of cutscenes the game has early on. In fact, based on some of the musical beats, the game wrestling the camera control away from you, story moments, even some character interactions, it felt like the game wanted to be more of a movie or a show rather than a game at times. Hell, some of the voice acting also didn't feel up to par with what people would expect from a AAA game at least. Most of the voice actors that did really well came from story important characters, like the Cuff, who, although many find annoying, actually did well for his character. And Frey also wasn't that bad in the voice acting departments, maybe good even. But aside from the story, there are the PC port issues, which at this point is common for Square Enix games. I had several performance issues despite having the recommended requirements, and I chalked them up to maybe I was missing something or my drivers weren't up to date. But after seeing reviews on Steam, I realized that the game is optimized poorly on PC. Frame drops, long loading times, texture pop, the works. So I absolutely can't recommend the PC version until that gets fixed. There are people who have reported not having issues, but the vast majority seem to be encountering them, including myself. And if you made it this far into the video, you're probably wondering how I could just call this game average and not bad after saying all of this. I may have said some things were just okay, but the more I talk about it, the worse it seems. Well, despite what the majority of those on the internet want you to think, there are things this game actually does well. Firstly, the game, despite being visually bland in some locations, looks very good. From the VFX of attacks, the design of some enemies, and the locations around the open world, all look really good. There are some genuinely great set pieces that are also good looking at that, and there are definitely rough areas, mostly in some of the faces of the characters and again some bland areas, but it doesn't detract from the good moments. Some of those issues could also be due to the PC version not being up to snuff, as the PS5 version seems to circumvent some of them. Secondly, there's the part of the game that has people divided, and that's the gameplay, especially the combat and how it works. There are those who love it and say it's like Devil May Cry, and there are those who say it's outright bad and unappealing. I can safely say that the gameplay is the highlight of the game, and although this is the case, just as I mentioned before, it won't be for everyone. Forspoken's combat and movement are well done and does something I've honestly not experienced before. It's not Devil May Cry, it's not Bayonetta, it's Forspoken, and it's doing its own things that works, and in my opinion, works well. It definitely took getting used to and adapting to fit how the game is intended to be played, but when I got it, I really enjoyed it. It's not like typical character action games where you're swapping between a plethora of different weapons to do sick combos, as Forspoken has a heavy emphasis on more ranged spell casting, with some melee spells being thrown in. You will be swapping between many different spells on the fly in the heat of combat, and in combination with your movement abilities and magical parkour, you'll be dancing around the battlefield once you get a hold of things. And if you're expecting something like DMC or Bayonetta, you will be disappointed. Just like those games though, you could 100% just pick a few spells that are your favorites and just brute force things, not engaging in the mechanics of the game. And although that is okay to do, the game gives you these tools to absolutely go crazy, and with it being as flashy as it is, it's almost a spectacle to behold. Here's a clip from someone on Twitter demonstrating what's possible. The original poster even made a full video that goes into depth about even more techniques and intricacies of the combat, and I'm actually going to link it in the description. I'm nowhere near being able to pull off things like this, but even just doing simple combos of spells and obliterating enemies is just as satisfying. Then when it comes to movement, magical parkour has been extremely fun for me to just run around the open world, jumping from roof to roof, climbing walls and more. The movement in Forspoken is flashy and satisfying as you traverse large landscapes and structures. And for progression, these spells and movement abilities will be able to be unlocked over time as you level up and gain mana points to in turn go into the spell list and unlock whatever you want. Now, when it comes to getting the stronger version of these spells and abilities, you'll be provided a certain challenge to complete while playing, which upon completion gives you the upgraded version of that specific spell. I really like this, as it's acting as a way for you to practice with a certain spell and get the stronger version. It's actively getting you to engage with your tools to gain mastery of them, and you are rewarded for doing so. Now, combat isn't the only part of the gameplay. There's crafting, but that boils down to just equipping your gear with bonus effects and upgrading them for more health or damage. The other main focus of the gameplay, aside from the main story quests, is side objectives found around the open world. From scouting missions that grant more lore or insight into the world and events, to simple chest puzzles, to clearing out an area of enemies, time trials, or the underground dungeons. There's even a short minigame that you can do to get some pets with a cat. The game suffers from what most open world games suffer from these days, and that's emptiness. There are things to do, and although getting between these points can be fun, it does get a little repetitive from time to time, depending on what your objective is. I do really enjoy the dungeons, even though they boil down to just different combat scenarios and then a boss fight, but that doesn't detract from how fun they can be, since the combat itself is really fun. I do also wish there was more variety in the common enemy types, mostly because you'll be spending most of your time fighting wildlife and zombies, rather than the more difficult and more engaging enemies, but when you do fight them, it's quite a treat. The gameplay, although not perfect, is good, and can be fun, but for sure isn't for everyone. Forspoken falls on its face in some areas, triumphs in others, and barely does okay in the rest, making the experience very middling overall. I honestly think the vitriol for this game is straight up mob mentality, and that many are hating on it because it's the cool thing to do, or they're just looking at a singular aspect of the game they don't like, rather than the bigger picture. I'll be honest, I was scared to make this video, mostly because of how people have been reacting to videos or posts that give even the smallest amount of praise for this game, but I felt I needed to make it as someone who finds themselves giving the game a place in the middle. I do believe that there are those that genuinely don't like this game, and there will be plenty more who come along and won't as well. But the hate for Forspoken is definitely overblown, and I'm glad that there are people out there enjoying this game. I for sure am. Is Forspoken worth the $70 it's retailed for? Well, that's for you to decide. And luckily there is a demo available for people to try it out for themselves on both Steam and the PlayStation Store. So, if you want to, try it out for yourself and make your opinions. As for me, I don't regret my purchase. And as usual, my name is CrossVee, and I hope to see you all next time. Love y'all. Peace.